Mrs. Thatcher's war on the old economy was about to change Scotland forever. Market forces prepared to do battle with state subsidy right here in Motherwell. Government, not the market, had brought the Ravenscraig steelworks to Scotland. It was the linchpin of Scottish industry, the towering symbol of post-war economic planning. State planning, that is. And the state arranged for it to buy coal from the state-owned mines and to sell steel to the state-aided car manufacturers and shipyards. The steelworkers took on the new government almost immediately. They went on strike in 1980 for higher wages. And they won. Their 19% pay rise was a red rag to the Thatcherite bull. State-owned British Steel was now losing £2 billion a year. How the Thatcherites hated all that. Ravenscraig came to stand for all that was wrong with Britain in decline. Its days and that of an old and settled idea of what Scotland was were now numbered. The steelworks that once stood here operated around the clock, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, without pause, for decades. This is where those famous cooling towers once stood. It pulled in generation after generation of school leavers and kept them for life, turning them into a highly skilled industrial workforce. It was a pillar of Scotland's whole economy. That's why the battle to save it became symbolic of something much bigger. It became a fight for a certain conception of Scotland itself, of what Scotland should be. And when you ask yourself who won that battle, take a look at what's here now. You would hardly know that there had ever been industrial activity at all. The largest industrial site in Scotland greened over in the battle against state subsidy. How did it happen?
In Scotland, more than in England, we were dependent on the large, heavy nationalised industries, all of which were technically bankrupt, all of which were dependent on handout by government, all of which were inefficient, overmanned and subject to trade union militancy. And it was inevitable that those industries could not survive at the size at which they were. They had to be reduced in size, and that was what happened.
Perhaps the Scottish economy was over-reliant on these heavy industries, and there was a need perhaps to reduce the number of people employed in these industries. But to say that these industries should be completely annihilated, I don't think it makes economic sense. And the pace of change was such that you had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people thrown out of work.
The Tories, in rising to the battle, knew they were taking on public opinion, knew they were courting unpopularity.
Sometimes it's presented as if this was a conscious decision, that somehow, ministers put on hair shirts and said it's going to be terribly painful and so forth. And of course there's an element of that. If you're going to do something difficult, then if it wasn't going to hurt, then it would have been done years ago. Politicians actually quite like to be popular, and therefore they don't opt to do things that they know will be difficult and painful and unpopular, unless they believe it profoundly to be in the national interest. So that was always going to be a difficult problem. In political terms, it was always going to be a more difficult problem in Scotland and in Wales, because the Conservative Party did not have the same political strength.
The price they paid in public support didn't deter them. One by one, Scotland's industrial giants failed the tests the government and the market set for them. In 1981, Peugeot Talbot closed its Linwood plant. Perhaps 13,000 livelihoods gone. Ravenscraig lost one of its biggest customers. Then the Invergordon aluminium smelter and the Corpach pulp mill, both vital employers for the Highlands, both now swept away. In 1985, British Leyland at Bathgate was no more, and with it the assembly of heavy trucks in Scotland. Linwood, Bathgate, then the Gartcosh steel mill. The names worked their way into protest songs and popular consciousness. As Hurricane Maggie swept through, all Scotland, it seemed, was shutting up shop. And Scotland began to feel the tug of an old sentiment, that of victimhood. It didn't accept the economic rationale of it.
Ravenscraig had the lowest man-hours per tonne figure in the whole of British Steel, which meant that we were the most successful plant in British Steel. But the the plans of British Steel was certainly to close Ravenscraig eventually, and they were trying everything they could to do that. But they had to take away the economic argument from us, and we still had the economic argument up until Garcosh went.
We were at the centre of world manufacture in what we were doing, and aided, of course, by the oil industry. So we had a real chance at that stage to take those industries forward rather than to close them down. And I used to get upset about people that you would have known who were big men in the steel industry in Lanarkshire, working in the furnaces. In their own locality they were big people being just cast onto the scrap heap. And so Scotland's sense of itself, of its skills, of its what Scotland was about, was around those industries.
At Ravenscraig, the fight went on. Workers walked in forlorn protest from Motherwell to Downing Street, evoking the hungry 1930s and the glory days of Labour history. It didn't work. Mrs. Thatcher refused to see them. Ravenscraig gave up the ghost in 1992. Do you think Scotland was being discriminated against?
The Scottish steel industry was being discriminated against. Scotland in general, I don't know. Somebody else could put that argument forward, but the Scottish steel industry was certainly being discriminated against. They destroyed an excellent plant at Ravenscraig.
That belief that Mrs. Thatcher was deliberately and unnecessarily laying waste to Scottish industry became widespread, part of the tale that Scotland told itself.